Welcome to In the News, Conversations Around Security, a new and dynamic podcast where we dissect the day's headlines through the critical lens of security risk management and where awareness meets analysis. Join us on the 1st and 15th of each month as we bring you a fresh episode packed with informative debates, expert analysis, and thought-provoking insights offering a nuanced perspective on the stories that shape our world. So buckle up and join us for a look at what's in the news, conversations around security. Hello, welcome to In the News, Conversations Around Security. I'm your host, Luciano Cedroni, and with me, Brian Clayman. And we have a returning guest, Phil Gurski, formerly of CSIS, who is now keeping himself occupied with his own podcast. And he's had some books, which we can get into at the end of the podcast. And he's very active on social media. And some of you may know him from his Borealis consulting services that he currently offers. So with that, welcome, Brian. Welcome, Phil. Brian, I'll turn it over to you for some initial comments before we get into this, what I think is going to be a very interesting chat.
Thanks, Luke. Phil, great to have you. It's, I think, the second or third time, and you are a very popular guest and a very knowledgeable person. We're talking today, as you know, about the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada and all the stuff associated with that. And we thought that there's probably no better person to have with us today. So thanks, Phil, for joining us again.
Well, thanks. The fact that it is my second or third time indicates to me that either A, you gentlemen are desperate because you don't have anybody else, or that I didn't screw up badly the first few times. So it's a pleasure talking to you guys. It's nice to have these conversations that are, they're real conversations and they're important conversations. So I appreciate the re-invitation to the podcast.
And to be honest, Phil, you're the only one who returns his calls. No one else has.
Ouch.
All right, so
that's it, Luke. Yeah, how to get the guests really motivated. Thank you.
All right, let's get into this one because we don't have a lot of time. We like to keep it pretty short and to the point. And Brian, I know you've got an opening question, so I'm going to turn it over to you with that initial question, and I'll jump in as I'm sure I will have plenty of questions to ask as well.
Okay, well, Phil, when you were on last, I think shortly after October 7th, and we were talking about what happened in Israel, and we were talking about the protests were just starting at that time in Canada. And I remember asking you a question at that time about the role of Hamas and how active are they in Canada and should they be taken seriously?
Ceasefire now! Look at us, Justin! You're killing kids! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Shame on you! You have blood on your hands!
And I think fast forward a few months, I think we know the answer to that. It's very serious, very impactful. But has the role of Hamas and other third-party entities, quote unquote foreign interference, has that changed? And how problematic is that?
I think it's a great question. And obviously it's a very difficult one to answer if you don't have access to intelligence, what CSIS and the RCMP or OPP or municipal forces are collecting. But it's obvious the protests are not ebbing. We're still seeing university campuses here in Canada being occupied, despite promises by university security officials, university administrations, local law enforcement, municipal governments saying, you know what, enough's enough, you've made your point, piss off. That's not happening. It only stands to reason then that given that these protests are ongoing, there has to be some, not genesis, but some operating function there, which means they're still continuing. Now, okay, it's obvious the war in Gaza is not ending anytime soon. We've all seen the reports on a variety of media of the horrendous casualty count, although I would caution to take casualty figures very, very carefully. Most of the casualty figures in Gaza are being provided by Hamas. And again, to remind the listeners, Hamas is a terrorist organization listed as such in Canada. And the last time when I worked in counterterrorism, you sure as heck wouldn't take terrorists at their word. And I'm not saying there have not been civilian casualties. I'm sure there have been thousands in Gaza. But just, when they say 32,000 people are dead, you might want to go to a secondary source. And as you gentlemen know, you're only as good as your sources. If your sources are reliable, great. If they're not reliable, then you've got faulty intelligence, and therefore you're giving faulty advice to whomever it is to whom you're reporting. Given that the war is not stopping, we've got a lot of emotional responses to it. Of course, we have the ICC case against Israel for acts of genocide, which, again, I think is the wrong approach because A, it's not genocide, and B, there are other ways to do it. But it begs the question for people who are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, reportedly, to try to bring attention to this, who's financing this? Who's providing the water bottles? Who's providing the tents? Who's providing? I mean, those people work for a living. I don't know about you guys, but I couldn't take part in a 6-month protest on campus. I can't now, or I'm retired.
Yeah.
But if I'm a 22-year-old, I don't know where you're getting your the coppers in your pocket to try and keep things going. So there've been a lot of allegations in the press. Again, not necessarily proven, that there obviously are other groups behind this. There's been some criticism of some of the groups that do have links to, for example, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, again, a listed terrorist entity in Canada. And therefore, even without access to intelligence, it's a fair conclusion to draw, albeit, without 100% proof, that these groups are very active here in Canada, and they want these protests to continue because they want their message to get out there. I have yet to see any criticism of Hamas in any of these protest groups, despite the fact that Hamas did carry out an attack that killed 1,200 people. It's almost as if, well, yeah, we killed 1,200, but the Israelis have killed 30,000, therefore they're worse than we are, kind of thing. We're still seeing Hamas represented as a bunch of freedom fighters. We're still hearing the slogans from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, which indicates the elimination of Israel as a state, wipe them right off the map. So I think it's a working assumption right now that these groups are still very active in Canada, and whether or not people are aware that Hamas is behind this, or whether that Hamas is playing a role in the background, you have to be pretty daft to think that they're not having some kind of influence on where these protests are going and the messages that are being sent out from these protests.
Luke, I just want to quickly say, you don't even have to answer this, but it's interesting. I think that even though Gaza is literally in ruins and there's so much disruption to everything that occurs in Gaza, Hamas is winning this war because they never intended. They knew they would never defeat militarily. And it's just amazing how we in the West have got hook, line, and sinker into that playbook. It's
shameful. And sorry, Luke, Hamas planned this all along. I mean, what people don't realize, or maybe they choose to ignore, Hamas couldn't give a rat's ass about Palestine. They couldn't give a rat's ass about the Palestinians. This is all about Hamas. And they knew that an attack of that scale on October 7th of last year, 1,200 dead, so many more wounded, the sexual mutilation, the rapes, the hostage taking, they knew they would invite a humongous, gigantic response from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And they didn't care. They didn't care that Israel was, as you said, Brian, is going to basically, turn Gaza into rubble. They don't care.
Yeah. Because
they don't care about the Palestinians. They care about, their mandate is to destroy Israel and to kill Jews. If the Palestinians are in the way, so be it. A few thousand Palestinians die. We still have our program. And further, among that, you talk about Hamas winning. They have won already. They won the propaganda war. And people are seeing them as sort of the wronged party. And as I remind people, as much as I detest civilian casualties, Israel would not be in Gaza as of late June 2024 had Hamas not launched an attack in October of 2023. Those are people who fail to recognize that are simply daft. They're simply stupid. Things have taken a turn for the worse, but this is purely Hamas. This is not Israel's fault. This is Hamas's fault. Now, you can criticize the Israeli response from a military perspective. I'm not a military specialist, so I won't go down that road. But let's not lose sight of what caused this thing in the first place. Sorry, Luke, that was a rather long interlude.
No problem. Brian and I talked about this on our last podcast. It's not just about Hamas. The conversation in Canada, I think, has changed. There's undertones there that speak to a bigger issue, whatever that is. My question is, how, we're not incompetent. Our CSIS guys are pretty good guys. I mean, you've been there. We know you. I think you're a pretty competent, smart guy. So
thanks.
They're good. They're good people working for us. They share that information with government. What does the government have to gain by keeping their mouth shut and allowing this? At the end of the day, people are losing faith in government. And how can that not be a concern for them?
I hate to tell you this, Luke, but it's all about politics. And if you're the governing power, and there's a riding in the GTA, so the Greater Toronto Area, that happens to be, majority Arab, majority Muslim, you don't want to go down that road. You don't want your security services to say, oh, by the way, we're concerned about Hamas support in this riding, in Etobicoke, or we're worried about PIJ support in this riding in Whitby. It all comes down to politics. And on top of that, you've got a government, and we've talked about the foreign interference with the PRC in earlier podcasts. We have a government that doesn't give a rat's ass about national security or public safety. That's been quite clear. They have no interest in it because it's inconvenient. And as a consequence, when you work for intelligence, you have clients. The way the intelligence, and you gentlemen, the intelligence cycle, right? You get requirements from your customer, your client. You figure out where do I get the information from? You collect it, you process it, you analyze it, you package it up, you give it to your client, you get feedback, and the cycle repeats itself. I don't know what the government is asking CSIS and the RCMP to do. But based on the track record of this particular government, of the Liberals, I can only draw the conclusion they're not asking the right questions, or rather, and this is purely speculative, and some might say maybe a little bit, tinfoil hat brigade here, maybe they don't want to know. They didn't want to know about Chinese interference. That was clear. So is it a great stretch of the imagination to suggest that they're telling CSIS and the RCMP, don't dig too deeply on this one? I don't know. And again, I don't want to come across as a conspiracy theorist, but the government's decisions in the past on very serious matters of national security seem to indicate that there's a reluctance to ask the security service to do what they're mandated to do because they don't want to hear what the answer is.
Well, and you see that now with the release of the names, right? Fighting us tooth and nail to keep that private and out of public view, and yet they work for us. We should have a right to know.
But Luke, quite honestly, and Phil, you guys are sort of overreacting because Elizabeth May read the redacted report or unredacted report, and she said nothing to see folks. So, stop stoking the fires.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just my cynical part. I'll get even more cynical, Brian. How many Green Party members were in Parliament?
I think she had, but 50% of her party, I think, as Nielsen on your podcast knows.
Yeah. Okay. So we have 2 MPs, or 1.5 or 1.25, doesn't really matter, kind of thing. Elizabeth May can say that for a couple of reasons. A, she's never worked in intelligence, so she probably had no idea what she was reading. Secondly, if you're the Green Party, you don't have to worry about PRC interference because the PRC isn't going to make any effort to infiltrate the Green Party because the Green Party, God love them, will never form the government in Canada. So if I'm a foreign intelligence service and I want to infiltrate a party, to influence MPs, to vote in favor of certain things in my interests rather than the national interests, the Green Party is the last party I'm going to worry about.
So, just to be clear, guys, I was joking.
We knew that, yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure the audience knows also. Hey, Phil, I want to ask you, in your recent YouTube video, you talked about the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada and its nexus to national security. Can you sort of elaborate where you're going with that or what you're thinking?
Sure. So we all know that anti-Semitism as a phenomenon is ages old, right? It goes back thousands of years. It predates the start of Christianity. The Jews, for one reason or another, have always been the picked on community, whether it's in Asia or the Middle East or Europe or North America. I mean, there are people much smarter than I am that can talk about the history of anti-Semitism, but it seems to be, an age-old phenomenon. Anytime that people are discriminated against or worse, targeted for violence because of who they are, and then who they are, that could be religious affiliation, it could be ethnicity, it could be skin color, it could be sexual orientation, whatever, is never a good day, right? And here in Canada, obviously, we have laws against harassment. We have laws against threats of violence, and we have laws against the use of violence. We also have here in Canada the ability that if violence is used and that violence is tied to a specific cause, i.e. you're targeting someone because of who they are for the aforementioned things I just mentioned, that's called a hate crime. Now, you probably familiar with this, Luke. I mean, hate crimes are really, really hard to deal with from a law enforcement perspective because if you threaten somebody with a knife, that's an act, and that's an obvious act. Why you threaten somebody with a knife, that's a different matter to determine. Unless the person writes like remember Ted Kaczynski, right? The Unabomber with his 1,500-page manifesto, whatever the hell it was, or Anders Breivik in Norway. The act is race versus the mens rea. We don't always know what the reason is for something. So hate crimes are a little harder to deal with because you really have to know why someone did something. But it seems to me that a lot of what we're seeing in Toronto, Montreal, and elsewhere here in Ottawa, at a minimum, qualify as hate crimes. Now, hate crimes per se are not national security. Okay, as a colleague of mine once pointed out, when I worked in anti-terrorism, terrorism is normally a public safety issue as opposed to a national security issue. So the terms are slightly different in terms of what their remit is. But I would argue that what we're seeing right now in Canada with anti-Semitism, at a minimum, has become a hate crime and possibly becomes a national security issue if, in fact, we're talking about the actual use of violence systematically against Jewish institutions, be they schools, be they synagogues, be they clubs. I just had a chat with a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine who's worked with the RCMP, who's out now in Nova Scotia, and they tried to do some kind of an event, and they were just basically bombarded with anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and anti-Zionist people across the street yelling vile things at them, kind of thing. So I would submit that the increase in incidents that are clearly anti-Semitic in nature, and this is not, anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, or we're angry about Gaza. Those are all part of it. If you're attacking a Jewish girls' school, that has nothing to do with Gaza. I'm sorry. You may be emotionally beside yourself because of the loss of civilian lives in Gaza, and I understand that. But what the hell does a bunch of 8-year-old girls have to do with IDF bombing of, Rafah? They have nothing to do with it. So that indicates to me you've taken this to a different level. It's not about stopping Israel. It's about finding Jews anywhere responsible for this and carrying out your retribution against them. So that's what I would say, and that's why I said in the video that this is upping at a level to where, because it is seemed to be systematic in nature and it's happening across the country, it's not an isolated incident anymore. This is where I would say it's definitely become a public safety issue. And if it truly is national in scope, you could call it a national security issue. So we've gone from, threats of violence to acts of violence to hate crimes to something I think a lot more serious. And again, back to our previous point, gentlemen, we talked about the government reaction to this. They seem to be saying the right words. Oh, and I've decided, how the government takes these things seriously? You count the number of times they put very in the sentence. So Chrystia Freeland says, we take national security very, 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 very seriously. And that's 5 veries. And she's used it, 4 times before. So we know they've upped it a bit, but I'm being obviously very cynical here. But the government has, and the other thing the government does, and I don't understand why, is they will condemn anti-Semitism. And then in the same breath, they'll say we also condemn Islamophobia, which they should, but they're drawing an equation between the two. And I'm sorry, I have not seen the statistics to support that the acts of Islamophobia, however you want to define that, are anywhere near the acts of anti-Semitism. And I even saw a report that came out the other day. It was, I forget which country it was, maybe it was Germany, that said, anti-Semitic or Islamophobic incidents had risen X amount of percent. And amongst those, and they called them crimes, Islamophobic crimes. And amongst those crimes, they included insults. Now, amongst the 3 of us, we've insulted each other on several occasions. I don't think insults constitute a crime under the Canadian Criminal Code. But if you're throwing everything in the same pot and calling it an Islamophobic crime, no wonder your statistics are going to go up.
It's a really good point, because if you're unable to say anti-Semitism is wrong without at the same time saying Islamophobia is wrong, that in itself is anti-Semitic. And I'll give you the example. When the mosque was attacked in Quebec City, that was an Islamophobic act of racism and hate, No one said, and also anti-Semitism is wrong, nor would it have been appropriate because they weren't the target. But for some reason, people, or certainly government, is unable to say one word without the other.
But again, Brian, it comes down to politics. Is that, the government, for some reason, I still don't understand, appointed an Islamophobia czar a couple of years ago. I read this woman's stuff. I'm not impressed. Again, we're drawing that these things are equal. And I'm sorry, as an old Intel guy, facts are facts and data are data. And, we've had firebombings of mosques and synagogues. Thankfully, we have our Jewish schools rather than synagogues. Thankfully, we haven't had any deaths yet, but I'm fearful this is only a matter of time. But if you are comparing someone throwing a Molotov cocktail at a kid's school in Toronto to someone giving you the stink eye on the street because you're wearing a keffiyeh or a hijab, then you have no idea what threats are. And you're not qualified to say that all these things are of equivalent. They're not of equivalent nature. I'm not in favor of idiots who run down the street, pulling hijabs off people's head. I think they're just useless wankers, personally. But I'm sorry, that is an order of magnitude much less than someone throwing a bomb against a girls' school.
Hey folks, if you're concerned about the security of your business, look no further than Brian Clayman and Associates. With its stable of experienced advisors and certified professionals, Brian Clayman and Associates provides tailored security solutions to help protect what matters most to you. Don't wait until disaster strikes. Give Brian Clayman and Associates a call today and take the first step towards a more secure future. When it comes to security, trust the experts. And now back to the podcast. But you also have like some pretty high profile media people and non-governmental people speaking the same stupidity. Brian shared with me an interview on air between Ezra Levant and John Tory, which you think is a very everyone knows John Tory is a pretty stable centrist type of a person, and he was doing the exact same thing whenever, and regardless of what you think about Rebel News and all that, he's got some good points. And in this case, we're talking about that van driving around town with this isn't Palestine or whatever it says. But he was quick to say right away, well, what about, Ezra asked him, what about the Palestinian van that's doing the same thing? Nothing's been said about that. And John Tory's right in there, just like you're suggesting, like, well, that's a different matter. I stood up for that. I will stand up for that. But he doesn't.
It's the old adage, guys, about Canadians, right? The old joke I always tell: why did the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle? It's like our governments think that we've got to be fair. We have to be fair. Heaven forbid we say something that somebody feels offended by. And I've been accused of that, right? I've been called racist for all kinds of reasons because I try to point out facts rather than speculation. We don't want to be seen as coming down on a side. And again, I think a lot of it's political. I mean, this is tangential to what we're talking about, but why do you think it is the government won't criticize Sikh extremism in Canada? Because there are a handful of ridings, not only on the West Coast, but also in Toronto, that are heavily dominated by Sikh diasporas. And there are members of those communities that if you say boo against Sikh extremism, guess what? We're not voting for you the next election. So we get these phrases that are completely meaningless. Oh, it's all about South Asian extremism. Like I say, we're not talking about Diego Garcia here. We're talking about Sikhs.
Yeah.
And the government is simply, for political reasons, is too afraid. They're cowards to call things what they are.
Well, that's sort of a good segue to my next question. Phil, in your opinion, and I realize this, be careful how you answer this because you're still very connected to both government and intelligence and the police community. But how influential is government at all levels, municipal, provincial, and federal, at sort of directing the police? Because coming from that background, I know that, policemen want to enforce the law and they want to do the right thing and they're moral characters, but the inaction of police, like Montreal Police just the other day had mentioned with the new encampment that was not on a university, that's in public space, saying that they have to go slow because they don't want to provoke violence, which is a ridiculous statement because we give them guns and bulletproof vests and all sorts of training because they're in that business. When they go after a bank robber that's armed, there's violence, but that's what they do. But somehow on this file, they don't want to provoke. Is that coming from the police or is that coming from government?
I can only speculate, guys, but I'm thinking it's coming from higher up. And this is critical because, if you're in Kazakhstan, there's no independence between the police and the government, right? But Kazakhstan isn't a democracy. In a liberal secular democracy, there has to be a gap between the government and the law enforcement services. Why? For the simple reason law enforcement can investigate the very government for which they work. As we're seeing with the foreign interference, right? The RCMP may be investigating the very MPs who sit in parliament or senators. I've had it suggested to me that maybe senators are involved as well. They have to have that independence. And yes, their customers are government. So law enforcement does report to the government, be it municipal, provincial, or federal in Canada, but they have to act according to their own rules and the Canadian Criminal Code. And they have to be able to implement their best practices based on their own experience on how to do things. And if they're being told, don't do this, that's blatant interference in the independence of law enforcement. We all agree. I mean, if you're in law enforcement, you don't want to make things worse. And that might be, look at the Freedom Convoy, right? What happened when they didn't take action early enough? You had a shit show, which eventually got resolved by the illegal, unconstitutional invocation of the Emergencies Act. We heard about that, a lot as well. So I'm one to say, look, as you said, Brian, you're the guys, you're the professionals, you're the guys who are trained. This is what we train you and pay you for. You exercise your judgment on when to act, how to carry it out. But I've got a sneaking suspicion that, somebody's saying to somebody somewhere, yeah, we don't want you to crack down on this. And if the police decide independently that this is not the right time, I got to be okay with that because that's their judgment. But if they're being told to do that for political reasons or for optics reasons not to do this, that's a completely different kettle of fish. And if we allow that to happen, then we are no better than Kazakhstan or Russia or China, where there is no separation between the state, i.e. the government, and the law enforcement and intelligence agencies. It would be the same thing at CSIS. I mean, yeah, CSIS collects information in accordance with requirements. As we said, it's the old intelligence cycle. But if the government's saying we don't want you to collect on this, there better be a damn good reason. If you're telling me I don't want to hear anything about possible Hamas infiltration of protest movements in Canada, well, that's against the CSIS Act, at least against sections 2B and 2C to do with foreign interference and counterterrorism. And I'm sorry, you don't have the authority to tell CSIS you can't investigate this if it's in accordance with the CSIS mandate or the RCMP or the OPP or Toronto Police, whatever kind of thing. So again, I don't want to go too far on this because I don't have any concrete proof that they're being told to do this and not do that. But it sure doesn't look good, guys, because we've seen this government send these messages out, and I can't help to think that it does have an effect. I mean, we talked earlier before we started recording the infamous systemic racism comment when Brenda Lucki was the commissioner of the RCMP, and she came out and she says, to the best of my knowledge, we do not have a systemic racism problem in the RCMP. And then 2 days later, she says, we have a serious systemic racism problem in the RCMP. Well, either she had a come to Jesus moment in 48 hours, or she got a phone call email saying, Brenda, do you want to be commissioner of the RCMP tomorrow? If you do, then you're going to say this. So I think there is an amount of political interference in this. And again, that is anathema to law enforcement and security. You cannot have government dictating how to do your jobs. Yes, they can help you in terms of requirements and help you in terms of prioritization. So we need to know a lot about this, a lot about that, but they cannot and they must not tell you, we don't want to know anything about that. That's just not the way it works in an independent democracy.
It reminds me, I read an article about a month and a half ago now regarding Sweden, and the Swedes they have significantly lost their faith in government after decades of being one of the strongest believers in government. And the guy from Sweden who was being interviewed actually said, and it reminds me of Canada, he goes, the problem with Swedes is that they refuse to acknowledge to call things what they are. And I think Canada suffers from that big time. And it's not doing us any favors when we refuse to acknowledge some of the things that are happening in this country, because there are very real world implications for our politicians, for our government, for our economics. We're isolated globally. Intelligence, we've talked about the lack of trust. We have our connections. I'm sure, Phil, to your point, you've got a guy in the US you can call, or in Australia you can call because of the relationship you've built. But going forward, if things don't change, we're going to be on an island very quickly.
We already are, and we're hearing it from NATO, we're hearing it from the Americans. You guys are simply not ponying up to the bar like you used to, which I think is a disgrace given our military intelligence and law enforcement history. That message is already being sent, Luke. And then we got the the pandering, we're going to increase our spending, blah, 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 blah. It's all horseshit as far as I'm concerned, because the government knows, and I've said this before, the government knows that the average Canadian doesn't care about national security. Yep. It's not a vote getter. When you go to the polls a year and a bit from now, hopefully sooner, Canadians don't vote about national security. They vote about inflation. Can my kids go to school? Can I afford it, kind of thing? But our allies are taking notice of this, and Canada is not just becoming a laughingstock amongst our allies. We're seeing it as an unreliable partner, and as a nation that, yes, historically we punched above our weight. Again, the famous quote: "We had the third largest navy in the world after World War II." And now we've got, I think we have 2 tugboats and a kayak, I think is what we have left in the Navy. As a nation that is a net importer of national security intelligence, if we're not contributing to the extent that we can, same on the military side, why would our allies go to bat for us? I don't want to get all Donald Trumpian and say, if you don't spend NATO's 2%, I'll have Russia invade you. But people they've sat up and take notice, and they've warned Canada privately and publicly, this can't be allowed to continue. So yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. And this is why I think a lot of people who, such as ourselves, have worked in law enforcement security in our careers, realize that it's time for this to get a lot more importance.
Well, I think we really have to wake up, because since the fall of the Soviet Union, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember thinking, my God, no more nuclear wars, life is good, we can think about prosperity. That peace dividend is past us. I mean, there is no longer peace dividend, and we have to wake up. And I hope that it doesn't take a catastrophic event like World War II, after Chamberlain sent peace in our time, to wake up.
I'm with you, Brian. I too remember I was at CSE, sort of doing sales intelligence during the end of the Cold War, and we all thought it was all over. As I said, I mean, I went to Moscow when they were part of the G8 to talk about counterterrorism. We thought they were on our side, and a bit of naivete, a bit of kind of optimism, and 1,000 points of light kind of thing. But yeah, that dividend, we spent that dividend a long time ago, and people don't realize just how dangerous things are. And we don't have to go to nuclear war. That'd be the ultimate, right? But we're looking at cyber attacks. We're looking at denial of service attacks. We're looking at cyber espionage. We're looking at there's a whole bunch of things. The world, in some ways, is I would argue it's kind of a more dangerous place than it was during the Cold War for the simple reason that during the Cold War, we knew who the enemy was.
Mm-hmm.
It was the Soviet Union and their allies in Eastern Europe. Now, it's not just Russia, it's China, it's Iran, it's North Korea, it's India, as we've seen happen here on Canadian soil. So if you're working in national security or law enforcement or intelligence, you're worrying about several things simultaneously. Whereas in the comfort, if I can use that term, of the Cold War, you looked at one major player all the time. Things are a lot more complicated now. I don't think Canadians realize that. And that's further to your point, this is why we got to start increasing. And if it means taking money out of pot X to put in pot Y, I think national security and national defense deserves a heck of a lot more money than DEI or whatever other programs are running to make us more woke. Yeah. But you're right. I hope it doesn't take an event. And by the way, gentlemen, I've been just read an article in the States the other day at the head of the CIA saying that the lights are blinking red in the States of a major terrorist attack that's going to take place. And I've heard from my sources that we here in Canada are seeing the same signals. So let's pray and hope that it doesn't get to that point. To get people to wake up, but yeah, we've been sleepwalking for the past 30 years.
No, Phil, I told you before we started the podcast, before recording, that I listened to your podcast and I follow you, and you depressed the hell out of me. You did not fail to depress me as we end today's segment.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions, Brian? Otherwise, I want to give Phil an opportunity to talk about what he's doing lately. I know he's got a petition that they got organized. Maybe give us some insight on that. And if he's got a new book coming out, we'd be certainly interested in hearing about that as well.
Yeah, I got nothing other than to say I got to call my therapist to schedule a session. So Phil, over to you, man.
I'm sorry. I'm sure you and your therapist will have a great conversation, Brian, and hopefully you'll come out as a better man on the end of it. Thanks again, guys, for having me on. It's always a delight to talk to you. You know what? You're right. It is a depressing topic. It's realism, unfortunately, and sometimes reality is depressing. If the silver lining is podcasts like yours. We're getting the message out for people to seriously think about these issues and not pretend they're not there. So from my perspective, yes, there is a petition that Nellie Shin, she was a former PC MP from Burnaby Coquitlam, you can find it on LinkedIn, you can find it on Facebook. It's a petition for the government to take anti-Semitism seriously. So if you could go on and find that and sign that. More from a personal perspective, I've got a new podcast that I've started with two former colleagues from CSIS. It's called Spies Like Us. It's a bit of kind of like what we're doing. It's kind of like three guys in a bar talking about national security, a lot of banter going back and forth, but also looking at serious issues on what Canadians need to pay attention to. And it's kind of sad when Canadians have to go to podcasts like ours to find out about the challenges of national security rather than hearing from the government themselves. That's not a good day kind of thing. Otherwise, yeah, I'm still putting out op-ed pieces in various places on my website, borealisthreatmist.com, and still plugging away on my book on the Fenians in the 1860s, looking at what was reliably the first terrorist threat to Canada in the 1860s. So it was a bunch of, basically, drunken American Irish trying to invade Canada and take over to put pressure on Britain to grant Ireland independence. So knock on wood, before I'm back on the podcast for hopefully a fourth time if I get reinvited, I'll have more to say on the book, and I'm hoping to get it published sometime this year, but I got to sit down and write it rather than keep appearing on other people's podcasts.
So this would be your 7th book, Phil?
Ninth.
Luke...
No, sorry, eighth. Sorry, eighth.
Luke has not read 8 books in his life, so that's quite the accomplishment.
That's not true. He's read Go Dog Go at least 3 times.
You got to get to audio, Phil. I don't know if you got audio yet, but that's what I do now. I use just audio thanks to Brian. Actually.
Somebody has suggested I do audiobooks, and I'm seriously thinking about it, but I'm not sure who wants to listen to my voice for 8 hours.
Oh, it's a pleasant voice to listen to. Listen to the competition is Brian. Come on. But yeah,
Well, if that's the case, then I'll do it.
It is easier, like for guys like us who are always mobile. You just put it on and it reads while you're driving or something like that. So it is a good platform, in my opinion. But I think to your point, people need to start taking attention. Certainly not people like us. We've been trying to pay attention for a long time, and guys like you that keep us interested and concerned is part of the the reason why we continue to pay attention, because we know it's important. And I think all three of us can say we love this country. We want to make it better, stronger. Maybe we don't want to get to our heyday, if you want to use that terminology, into the 50s and 60s when we were punching well above our weight. But it'd be nice to punch at this point. We don't even do that. We just sit there.
I think it's a really good point. Sorry to interrupt, Luke. I think it's a good point. Why do you guys have your podcast, and why do I have my podcasts and my blogs? It's because we care.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because, we were at the coalface. We saw how things operated. We're seeing things now that are not done well, or not done at all. And we're concerned. And I think given the experience that we have a perspective and an insight that the average person doesn't have. I mean, the three of us could stop this tomorrow and go golf. The reason why we've elected to do this is because we care. And as you said, we're all, proud Canadians, and we want this place to be as safe and as prosperous as possible. And when we see stupidity at the level we've been seeing, especially with the foreign interference file, it grates on us.
Yeah.
And it worries us that we've got people for whom we elected, they're our representatives, not taking this stuff, not taking it at all, let alone taking it seriously. So this is why, I congratulate you guys for your podcast. And this is the best chance to get out there. It's kind of sad that it takes three old, retired guys to do this, but no one else is doing it. And that's, I think, why we collectively, devote our time to doing this in our retirement.
And we will continue to do that. Sorry, Brian, I don't want to cut you off. We'll continue to do that. And for those who want to find Phil, he's on LinkedIn. He's all over LinkedIn. Borealis Risk Consulting is his private sector consulting business. Spies Like Us is a podcast show. You can probably hear it on any platform, I would think, right? As long as it's a podcast.
It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts right now.
Perfect.
And I must say, Luke, it's almost as good as ours. Not quite well worth the listen.
Oh, there's a challenge. Okay.
Well, it's all
thrown down. I get it.
It's all a reflection of your co-host, Brian, and I can only do what I got. I can't make lemon out of oranges. All right. With that, folks, thanks again, Phil, for joining us. God, I hope this country turns the corner and we head in the right direction, wherever that is, in the next few months. Hopefully sooner we don't have to wait a year to throw this bum out, but fingers crossed. So till then, talk to you all next time.
Bye, Phil. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.